What is up, beautiful people? So I know what you're thinking, where have you been? And I've missed you too, but I've had other things going on. I promise I'm going to stay on top of YouTube as much as I can. And this one's because it's a video that I think is actually necessary to talk about, and we're going to do this as a series, even though I've been putting the episode number on every single one of these videos. Don't even ask me why. So what we're talking about is variations. Now I'm going to do this for each main lift, squat, bench and deadlift, no, not overhead press, but we're going to go through what the purpose is behind the variations we pick, less so from a programming standpoint and more so from a technicality standpoint, what we're implementing them for, what they are to address, and so on. Now also bear in mind there are countless different variations within the squat, and if you're a beginner intermediate, I think we start with 3 fundamental ones. Now obviously you have your tendency to be a low bar competition style squat. That's not what we're going to talk about. So what we're going to talk about is a tempo squat, a pause squat, and a high bar squat. Now we're going to go under the assumption that you know roughly what they are, but in short, a tempo squat is just defining a set tempo or cadence for each portion of that movement. It can be something like 4-0-0, 3-1-0, and that's just meaning 4 on the way down, 0 at the bottom, and 0 on the way up. 0 doesn't mean you need to move it as fast as possible, it just means there's no set pace. Now we'll get into the specifics of that in a minute, so we'll move on to pause squat. A pause squat is just specifying that at the bottom of the movement, an assumption because we can actually pause at different portions, but again, a further variant that we need to discuss. We're just talking about a pause at the bottom for a specific count. So if that's a 0-1, so a 1 count, that is at the bottom holding for 1 second. If it's a 2 count pause, that is 0-1-2, that is a 2 count held at the bottom position. And lastly is a high bar squat. Now again, this is kind of on the assumption that you are a low bar squatter most of the time. This might not apply to you, but then you're in a very rare amount, I'd say like 10%, maybe less of people are actually better at a high bar squat than they will be a low bar squat. But if we're talking within strength sports, the assumption is you're probably going to be a low bar squatter. Now high bar just means that the bar sits further up. It isn't a specific position because they're both on a spectrum, high bar to low bar. There's a big old field of exactly where that bar sits, but it's higher on the neck. It's kind of sitting up into the trap across the blade of the scapula. Okay, so now we want to talk about why we're using these. In my programming, these 3 get used at different phases of programming, and it kind of comes down to the lifter that you get from day one. See, at the beginning, most people have the same issues, and objectively speaking, there are fundamental issues everyone should address. And the fundamental issue for most people from day one is just understanding weight distribution. So what we're talking about is the ability to maintain pressure through your full foot on your eccentric through the bottom position and back on the way up. If we don't have that pressure, we shift forward, we shift back, the bar path changes, and that's what we're trying to make sure they can understand fundamentally. Now 9 times out of 10 when you're taught to do something, they teach you to do it slowly, make sure you can feel it, make sure you can understand what it is you're trying to apply. Anything at pace is significantly harder to control. Now this is why very frequently within my programming, a tempo variation will be used at the first block. Now a block is just saying a number of weeks we're going to use a similar stimulus, a similar exposure, the number of times you're going to do something on repeat. So to start with, that kind of directs us towards a tempo squat. It gives us time under tension, time to control the movement, and time to develop that awareness. Now when we say tempo, that doesn't mean it has to be control on the way down plus a pause and then any sort of tempo on the way up. That's a number of variations within the same movement. Most of the time we'll give something that might be a 3 count on the way down, a 0 second pause, and 0 on the way up. So we are controlling that foot pressure and then pushing away. That gives us the time to control that variable. So why would we use a pause squat over using a tempo squat? Now that's when we're talking about the position coming out of the bottom. See, most people hit the bottom, assuming the weight distribution is pretty spot on, they hit that position pretty well, and then it's the conversion, the ability to get from that position back up, but maintaining important factors. The most important factor most of the time is keeping the quad underneath us, keeping those legs involved. Most people come up and they have a rapid knee extension, so the leg comes back quickly, the hips come up, the chest falls. This is a chest fall pattern. Now most people when they talk about this, they talk about try not to let the hips come up early, but that's actually a symptom. That's not really the cause. The cause is that knee extension. So what we need to see is pinning the knees, holding that knee position, keeping the quads engaged, and so that introduction of an isometric hold at that bottom position gives us time to control, keep the load through our legs, and then hold the pressure. Now, most of these variations require good and accurate cues to be applied at the same time. So we might say something like your pause squat, just want to focus on trusting your quads or stay in your quads or pin the knees forward so that we're maintaining the ability to convert that to our main squat. But that's, again, it's on the assumption that we're tying those two things together. Most of these variations are limited by the ability of the lifter to understand what they're trying to implement. And then we have a high bar squat. Now, it's not that it works the quads more as such, it's more that it's increased time under load for the quads, so it works them for longer as opposed to more specifically. But what we're talking about really is just trying to maintain a more upright position because the bar is higher up, which means that there's less of your back involved in the corrections. The room for error is a bit smaller because that shift off bar path with errors is quite significant. Whereas a low bar squat, we're able to get the back involved, kind of recover some of those mistakes. It tests the bracing quite significantly, and again, it puts more stress through your legs as opposed to putting that work onto your back and legs. Now, this tends to be when someone has some of those features controlled because they need to have control of their weight distribution. They need to have great control of their knee positioning. And if you've built some of those fundamentals in with work like the tempo squat, with work like your pause squat, then at this point, high bar tends to be easier for the lifter to apply without significant breakdown, because breakdown in this movement tends to lead to significant breakdown, potential injury risk, and less carryover. Now, this tends to be, again, I'm using the word tends a lot because there's so much subjective variation here, but this tends to be why we'll see an ordering with lifters for a block using tempo work, the following block using pause squat, and the following block using high bar work. This can vary based on what their actual needs are, or the cues that they're trying to apply, or the corrections we're trying to make, but on an assumption, that means that we have time to focus on weight distribution, followed by knee positioning, followed by bracing and knee positioning tied together, and then just building up some relevant volume. Now, yes, there are more variations we can look at, but the important thing is to think of the number of tiers of variation you're implying. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we're talking about the number of tiers, if you've changed numerous variables, that's a low tier variation. We've taken something that was a simplistic low bar squat. If we've introduced a pause, that's one variation. If we've introduced a pause and a control on the eccentric, a tempo, that's two variations. And if that bar position has changed as well, that's three variations. And so the distance from the specific movement has really increased. So what we're looking for is not to get too far away so that we lose the relevant features that we're trying to train, but getting far enough away that we can actually train some other features. See, just low bar squatting over and over again is going to make it difficult to apply new cues. We need the external stressors sometimes just to reinforce those patterns. Now, you can be harsh. You can implement two at a time. You could get something like a tempo squat with a 4-2-0 count, brutal, but it gives time to control your weight distribution. It gives time to understand where your legs are, making sure that you are getting some tension through your quads, some control through that positioning. And it also means that we can limit your load. And that's another big factor of using variations, is it's a self-limiting variation. A tempo squat, by its nature, the time under tension, the difficulty of the movement, means that you're not going to be able to put 90+% of your max on that bar, which means I can limit the weight you're going to use and make sure the relative intensity is still quite high, even though the load used is quite low. So these are kind of your three fundamentals. So most of the time you just want to be looking at what it is you need to fix in your squat. Do you rapidly extend your knees? Then maybe look at the control of a pause squat and placing your focus there. If you find that you drop too quickly into your squat, or you're shifting onto your toes before you're converting into the concentric portion, then maybe tempo work is important for you. And if you find that you're maintaining those two features, but your bracing is letting you down, or you just want to make sure that those are nailed in and you have some limiting variation, you can work with your high bar. Now, again, there's a lot of nuanced features to each of these. Then when we're talking about programming and volume and the number of sets and reps, there's a lot more to talk about, but they're the fundamentals. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I just want to go through some of the basic features of it. If you have any questions, drop them below. I will get back to you. And I will be doing this for each of the movements if you're interested and if you find this helpful. I'll speak to you beautiful people soon. Peace.